Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the beloved and acclaimed novelist, John Irving.
Thank you very much. Kurt Vonnegut was the first reader of my first novel. It was set in Vienna before the Anschluss and in post-war Austria during and after the Allied occupation. I was lucky to have Vonnegut for my first reader. He'd been a POW in Dresden. Kurt knew about the Nazis and what happened in Europe after them. I was also lucky to have Joe Fox at Random House for my first editor. As a young writer, if you have a good editor, you develop the confidence to take risks. You know your editor will catch you if you fall. Joe Fox and Random House published my first 3 novels. Then Joe had the insight and the courage to kick me out. With The World According to Garp, my 4th novel, Joe knew he couldn't really rally the rest of Random House behind me. He told me to go to a smaller publisher where a single editor could get the whole house to support me. Joe Fox was a visionary. He even told me which publisher and which editor to take Garp to. Henry Robbins at Dutton was successful with Garp, but Henry died. Should I come back to you in Random House? I asked Joe. Too soon, Joe said. What he meant was the rest of Random House wasn't begging him to have me come back. Joe sent me to Harvey Ginsberg at William Morrow. Harvey was a great editor. Harvey published The Cider House Rules and A Prayer for Owen Meany. Then someone new was hired to run William Morrow. Harvey wasn't crazy about the new boss. Now's the time to go back to Joe at Random House, Harvey told me. Harvey's right, Joe said, but we'll make Random House pay Harvey to be your editor. Harvey knows the way you write now better than I do, Joe Fox told me. He was looking after me, even when he wasn't my editor. Joe would publish The Son of the Circus at Random House. That novel had a first reader who got Joe's attention. At the time, this was the longest novel I'd written. Joe made a young editorial assistant read it. This young reader wrote some notes. The notes were written for Joe, not for me, but the notes were so good, Joe wanted me to see them. The notes were amazing. I called Joe, and he spelled it out for me. After I die, and I will, this kid should be your editor, Joe told me. A Son of the Circus was published in 1994. Joe Fox died in 1995. A few years later, this is why I ended up with Jonathan Karp as my editor. I did what Joe Fox told me to do. John Karp is the best editor I've had, and I've had 4 good ones. I'm very happy for John and for Simon & Schuster's Centennial.
I was writing a book about the largest library fire in American history, an arson fire at the Los Angeles Public Library that destroyed 400,000 books and damaged 700,000 more. While working on the book, I realized that I had never seen a book burn. As a diligent reporter and someone who really likes to describe things accurately, I needed to commit the act. I needed to burn a book. But it wasn't as easy as it seemed. Burning a book felt like a gesture of violence, one that would connect me with the worst people in the history of civilization. As it was, I could hardly bring myself to even get rid of a book, even one I had no plans to read, or one that was tattered and worn and past the point of salvation. But for the purposes of my book, I had to do it. I needed to witness the burning of a book. So now the problem was to choose which one. At first I thought, I'll just burn a book I don't like. Wouldn't that be easy? I went to my bookshelf and eyed a few unlucky candidates. Books I'd never opened, books I read and hated. So many choices. Then I wobbled. It seemed so nasty to burn a book I didn't like. I just couldn't do it. Okay, I thought, I'll burn a book I like. At least then the act wouldn't seem so hostile. I surveyed my favorites. I see you, Faulkner. I see you, Hemingway. I see you, John Irving. But damn it, I couldn't burn a book I liked. It just seemed so wrong. A few days later, I had a brilliant thought. I would burn one of my books. Thanks to the generous folks at Simon & Schuster, I have lots of copies. Perhaps I even have too many copies. I ran my hands over my stash. I would only be dooming one of them. How bad could that be? And yet something rose up inside of me and resisted. This is insane, I thought. I can't burn one of my own books, the fruit of my loins, my life's work. I can't. I gave up. I conferred with my husband, John, and I told him that as good an idea as it seemed, as important as it was for my research, I simply couldn't do it. There was something in me that couldn't overcome this taboo, the feeling that burning a book was terribly wrong. John urged me to reconsider, but I wouldn't. I was going to have to write about this epic library fire without knowing what a burning book looked like. Then one day, John came home with a huge smile on his face. "Come here," he said. "I've got it. I've got the perfect book for you to burn." He reached inside a bag and pulled out a fresh new copy of Fahrenheit 451. The perfect candidate. The book about book burning would be the book I would burn. And I thought to myself, this is why I married John.
What's happening? Everybody okay? Y'all all right? Okay. So, Jesmyn, my first question, and the biggest question I have for you this evening. You are, to me, I know you hate this, but to me and to many of them, one of the greatest of our time, right? One of the greatest contemporary writers of our time. And someone who has, absolutely, and someone who has accomplished all that you've accomplished and done all the things you've done. My question is, where does this begin? Like, how does this begin for you?
When we were upstairs in the balcony and we were watching everyone on stage, I was thinking about how I would answer that question because I didn't have anything prepared. I thought back, to my childhood, and I came late to reading. I wasn't an early reader. I struggled to learn how to read. I finally got it when I was in first grade. But once I learned, I attempted to read. I read a lot, right? I was a library reader because I only had access to my elementary school library, and so I grew up in the 80s, so I read a lot of Newbery, award books, Caldecott, right? Island of the Blue Dolphins, Scholastic Book Fair would come and it was like Hero in the Crown, and right? I read lots of books about, I found myself drawn to books about like spunky, fiery, smart, courageous girls, right? And all of those books that I read about those kinds of girls, those stories resonated with me, right? And then when I got older and I was in junior high and I was in high school, I discovered The Bluest Eye, and I discovered The Color Purple, and I discovered, For Colored Girls, who into Zakiya, right? And those books also resonated with me, but nothing reflected me. And I think that perhaps part of the reason that I read the way that I did so voraciously when I was a kid and when I was growing up is because I was constantly trying to find the book that would reflect me. And I think some books came really close, like the aforementioned books, right? But none of them were a clear mirror. Like I couldn't see myself in the books that I read, and I couldn't see the people around me in the books that I read. And for me, like as I was sitting up there, I started thinking about, okay, so maybe it wasn't one book, right? Maybe all the books that I read and that I loved as a child and as an adolescent, like maybe they sort of ferried me towards this endeavor. But for me, there was a document, I think, that really set me on my way, and it was, my brother was killed by a drunk driver when he was 19, and the drunk driver was not held accountable for his murder, and so it was a court document, right, where that person was actually charged with leaving the scene of an accident. And I saw that court document when I was like 23 years old, and the complete erasure of that document, I think that set me on my path.
I only had one ambition in life. I had never ever thought of doing anything else but becoming a writer. So at the age of 7 and 8, I started sending out my very heartfelt, very beautiful poems to my mother's women's magazines. Lined notebook paper, sharpened number 2 pencil, my best printing. And I had a specialty. My specialty was that every poem I wrote and sent out had a dead body in it. The first one was a note to my dead mother and father, both alive and rather irritated. I went through dead dogs, dead soldiers. I once killed an entire very large family. And this wasn't because I was a particularly morbid little girl, but because my mother's favorite poem, which she recited often while I was growing up, was Annabel Lee. Well, you know, that's Poe, his beautiful maiden, and the tomb by the sounding sea, and this creepy boyfriend that comes and sleeps with her at night. I loved it. And somehow I got the impression that a poem couldn't be a poem unless it had a corpse in it. So I delivered right through to the end of my teens. And as I was writing this talk the other night, it suddenly struck me that it was really so sad that I had written all these beautiful poems, and not only did they not publish them, they probably didn't even read them. And then I got this thought, I have a captive audience tonight. And it's only going to be 4 lines, but folks, I am going to recite to you the poem I wrote when I was 18 years old. Keep in mind, I was a very, very sincere 18-year-old. Death and desire crumpled in a corner, and I am black, the solitary mourner. often finale, but birth, thank God, more often. And yet I fear, I know too well, the coffin.
One night a few years ago, I was in the operating room on call when one of my residents brought me an emergency CT scan of a man's head. Immediately, the problem was really clear to me. Just between the man's skull and his brain, there was this concave strip of blood, something known as a subdural hematoma. It's causing pressure on the man's right frontal lobe, and this is typically a surgical emergency. Now, just as I was getting ready to take the next steps, the resident told me the patient's age, 93. Suddenly, several things started to swirl in my head. What kind of life did this man have? What kind of life would he want? And where is that line between prolonging life or prolonging death? I thought a lot about my own parents. What would they be thinking at that age? With all this in mind, I went to go talk to his family to have a conversation. Now, a woman who looked to be only in her 60s walked over to me, introducing herself as his wife. I momentarily hesitated, and sensing my confusion, she said, "I'm actually older than he is. I robbed the cradle." She was 94 years old. She was in perfect health, took no medicines, was still driving, and had in fact driven her great-grandkids to school earlier that morning. Her husband, my patient, the 93-year-old, I was told was even healthier than her. He was still an avid runner, worked part-time as an accountant. They kept him around, his 65-year-old son told me, because he was such a whiz with numbers. In fact, his brain bleed had occurred because he had fallen from a roof because he climbed up there with a leaf blower to clear away the leaves. These nonagenarians, as they're called, were healthier than most of my patients at any age. So given all that, I took the man to the operating room to perform a brain operation known as a craniotomy. You drill several burr holes into the skull, use an electric saw device to connect those burr holes, and you remove a flap of bone. After that, I opened up the outer layer of his brain, known as the dura, and then I was looking at that large collection of blood. I carefully removed that blood collection, stopped any remaining small bleeders, and the critical part of the operation was completed. The man of the brain was decompressed. Now, all that was left to do was close the dura, replace the blown flap, and suture the skin. Before I did that, however, I decided to closely inspect his brain. And what I saw really surprised me. Given how sharp he had been, how cognitively intact, I expected to see this large brain pulsating robustly, looking healthy. And what I saw looked like a 93-year-old's brain. It was more shriveled, it was more sunken, had these deep wrinkles indicative of his age. Now, if this sounds disheartening, it should not. In fact, just the opposite. It's a reminder that it didn't matter what his brain looked like, it mattered how it performed. Of course his brain had aged. He was 93 years old. But the brain, maybe more so than any other organ in the body, can reliably grow stronger and grow sharper throughout life. I think it's the only organ that in many ways can defy aging. It's what inspired me to write the book, Keep Sharp. Now, as you might imagine, I was anxious to see how this gentleman would wake up from the operation. I went to go visit him in the ICU, and I found him lying in bed reading his smartphone. He told me he was following the recent elections in West Africa, as one does after emergency brain surgery. It was pretty clear that he was recovering well, and after examining him, I decided to ask him, how did the whole event really affect him? How did it make him think about his mortality overall? He smiled and he looked at me and he said, "You know, I think the biggest lesson in all of this is no more trying to blow the leaves off the roof." That guy taught me a lot. You see, increasingly we think of someone like him as the exception to the rule, but I think our thinking is starting to shift. It is possible that 93-year-old man is becoming the rule.
I wanted to tell a story tonight that's really special to me. So when I was getting ready to write my novel in 5 years, I knew one of the main characters was going to have to die. And I was like really trying to get out of it. I was trying to avoid it. I didn't want to have to go through it, but it had to happen. It was the best version of the story. And I was really scared. I was scared of what I was going to have to put the character through. I was scared of what I was going to have to go through. And I'll never forget this. My very dear friend and fellow novelist, Lila Sales, said to me, just stay close to her. And I always think about that when I'm starting a new project and I'm nervous about like the journey ahead of just taking my protagonist's hand and staying close, and that together, if we maintain that, we can like cross whatever divide we have to get across in order to tell the story that needs to be told.
I think that that's really, so as someone who has so much fear, I'm looking up at these books, which also it's so fun. But the first one up there for me, I was so fearful about trying to figure out how to get through it that I had 90,000 words back in 2015 of that book that I threw, not metaphorically, quite literally. I was driving down Highway 29 in Northern California, and I threw it into a bend. It was saved on my computer, so it was more of a gesture, but I was like, I'm gonna get rid of this right now because I was so fearful I couldn't find the end of that book. And the one next to it, which is coming out in September.
It's so good, I've read it, it's so good.
That book has two characters on which the axis of everyone else sort of, rolls around. And for me, I always try to write into the good of people. Even my villains aren't particularly villainous. And these two characters are actually quite complicated. They have a 50-year love affair that some people I felt like might take issue with. And in trying to figure out how to tell their story, I have found myself having a lot of fear about the perception of them. Yeah. And I came across this quote in my research. There's an architect in the book, and Louis Kahn, the Salk Institute, he had a quote that now I can't believe I didn't have keeping me company for all the years I've been trying to sit at my desk and do my work, which is that when something brings you fear, when something brings you difficulty, instead of suppressing it, which is our instinct, what if we own it? And so I went the other way when I saw that with these characters, and I instead of anticipating judgment, I leaned into the judgment, and that's sort of when the good came out.
Yeah.
And so I think about that now in terms of how, we can approach fear in writing.
Yeah, and I think that in thinking about and talking about what we wanted to share with you all here tonight, I think we really came to that the book that you're afraid to write is the book that you're meant to write. When you feel that resistance, that fear of what your character's gonna have to go through, what you're gonna have to go through, judgment of them being out in the world, it means you've tapped into something, a story that wants and needs to be told.
I have always wanted to be a writer, right back as far as I can remember. I was always scribbling little stories that grew into longer stories, and finally, by the time I was a teenager, into, I guess, book-length things, maybe not books. All through my teens and my 20s, I was writing and writing, but for some reason, I never tried to get published. I kept writing and putting my books under the bed, and I think it was this combination of raging imposter syndrome and something else, kind of the opposite, a kind of pride and a reluctance to know for sure that I was not good enough. It wasn't until I had kids that something changed. I was on maternity leave with my second baby. I was in a library, looking down the barrel of having to go back to work at a fairly demanding job, and I realized suddenly that my writing was a hobby. And I didn't have time for hobbies anymore. I barely had time to wash my hair. If I didn't find a way to make my writing pay, ideally enough for an extra day's childcare, I was not going to be able to keep doing this thing that I loved. And so, for the first time, I invested in myself. I bought a cheap laptop so that I could type while my baby napped. I bought books, Stephen King's on writing. I submitted, and I got rejected. Of course I did. The worst had happened. Someone had echoed that little voice in my head and told me that no, actually, I was not good enough. 5 years before, I would have shelved the book. I would have crawled back into my shell, but this time something had changed. Maybe having kids had made me braver, more willing to sacrifice my pride for something that I truly wanted. Maybe this time I had written a book that I simply couldn't bear to shelve. Whatever the reason, I kept revising, I kept submitting, and eventually I found an agent and a publisher, and 15 years later, here I am. Of course, that little voice in the back of my head saying, is this really the best you can do? That little voice has not been silenced by being published. It has stayed very loud. It has given me some pretty sleepless nights, mostly at 3 a.m. in the morning when I'm too far through a manuscript to quit. But it has also pushed me to try harder, to hone my craft. I think it has made me a better writer. And for that reason, I never want to silence it. Well, not completely. But there is another reason why I want to keep listening to that voice. And it's one that is not actually about me at all. Because the flip side of the question, why me, is the answer, why not her, or him, or them? Because the truth is, I have been astonishingly lucky with my career. I've been lucky with my books, I've been lucky with my timing, I have been lucky most of all with my simply extraordinary publisher, the reason we're all here tonight. And there are plenty of amazing writers who haven't been as lucky as me, writers who fully deserve a place at the table, but who haven't been given one for whatever reason. And that is something that I never want to forget. So I guess what I have learned over the years from my imposter syndrome is not to ignore that little voice inside your head, to try to listen to it, learn from it when you can, let it make you more careful, more diligent, more exacting, but don't let it make you afraid, and never, ever let it shut you up.
So much of the narrative of The Other Black Girl was more about who I am, or who I was, really, because I feel like I've outgrown Nella in my own way. I've had to lead conversations, I've had to speak out, especially while making the TV show, because woo, that stuff is hard. And I've had to just really lean into the craft again, and that's the most beautiful part of it all, right? It's not about sound bites, it's not about social media and all of that. I mean, it is, but it's not, right? It's because you enjoy doing it and doing what you love is a wonderful thing that we get to do.
I've become more and more interested in what I think of as inadvertent storytelling. Genres we use for practical purposes that have unintended narrative qualities. One of these is the to-do list. Now, I am an excessive maker of lists. In fact, as of this morning, I have 990 lists in the notes function on my iPhone, dating back to 2011, when I got the phone. Clearly, I don't delete my lists. And the reason is that the moment a list is obsolete, it leaves the utilitarian sphere and becomes an artifact. It was poignant for me to reread on my very oldest list for my son's 9th birthday party, 1 hour, 15 minutes bounce time, and recall the party venue we booked in Brooklyn where kids bounced on inflatable slides. That same son's most recent birthday was 21, and any bouncing that took place was likely not intentional.
Where do you get your ideas? Ideas for books are not necessarily what you imagine ideas for books to be. These books of mine, they don't come out of a notebook full of thrilling themes and socially relevant storylines and twisty-turny what-if scenarios I want to explore. They're not based on things I've read about or people I've met or stories they've shared with me. Sorry for all the people who shared stories with me. In lots of ways, they're not even ideas. They come from out there, my books, from the world that I see in dizzying, swirling fragments every day of my life. Banal, benign, boring fragments that for some reason land in my head with a satisfying thud and make me wonder about things, about people, about houses, that make my thoughts spiral towards untold stories and unseen worlds and people I'll never know. They come to me as windows, doors, eyes, fleeting tableau. A slight woman wearing a sheer muslin skirt, her skin tan mahogany, her hair thick with salt water. She's holding two small children by their hands as she yanks them up the boardwalk past the uninterested gaze of diners eating lunch at an upmarket beach club in Nice on the French Riviera. She strides towards the members-only shower block at the other end. She is clearly not a member. She looks frantic, she looks stressed, she looks hungry. She looks for some reason as if she has a story to tell. I store her away in my weird writer's brain and then think about her obsessively until the moment I can start to write about her.
I don't think you used to be able to be a leader without having read, maybe not right, but at least read enough to know about American history and your place in it and what it is you were trying to achieve. And now, you know, attention spans have shrunk so much that people believe that, you know, sound bites and clicks and, you know, videos substitute for, you know, really reading and immersing yourselves in history. And I do think there's a big danger that we're forgetting big chunks of our history and therefore missing the lessons we should be learning, because there are patterns in human nature, human life, human interactions, and the decisions that leaders are faced with. I'm teaching a course now at Columbia about, you know, crisis decision making, and it's all about how do leaders get the information they need to make decisions. And it's not just in the moment that you look, but how does that moment connect to previous times, and what do you learn from that? So I'm hoping that we can have more of an effort to try to re-educate ourselves about our own history through reading, and those able, like yourself, through writing, to make it an even richer story.
Can we just close on you talking a little bit about a specific era in history that you're thinking a lot about these days, and that's suffrage?
Yes.
And this sort of new venture, but also the connective tissue between topics around the right to vote for women in particular, but the right to vote more broadly, and the ways that we educate through the theater, through the arts, and the importance and the power behind, in particular, this issue around suffrage.
Well, Eric is referring to the fact that I have the great privilege of being a producer of Suffs, the new musical on Broadway this season, and it is the story of the critical period between 1913 and 1920. In 1913, the suffragists waged the first ever protest march in Washington, D.C., to claim the right for women to vote, and it took 7 years, but finally the 19th Amendment was passed. And there's three quick things to say about it. One, the stories of these individual women, the choices they made, some of them had been fighting for suffrage for decades and were determined to play the inside game, to convince, you know, first people in states and then eventually the Congress to go ahead and put the amendment to be ratified out across the country. Some were young and too impatient to wait around for that process, and they were the ones who were on the front lines. They were the ones picketing Wilson's White House. They were the ones literally going to jail, being force-fed because they were on hunger strikes. And you could see the kind of, you know, yin and yang of how change is made in a complicated country like ours. And you needed both. You need the people who would have tea with Wilson and keep pushing him shaming him in a very polite and ladylike way, and then the people protesting him and holding up the signs that he was betraying democracy, fighting a war overseas, but not giving women the right to vote. So it's a very relevant story, because how do we make change today? But it's also relevant because the sacrifices that were made to get the right to vote, the legal right to vote, which then took, another 40 plus years to get the legislation to actually enforce it. And now, we're facing a consequential, some say existential election, and there are people who are bored by it or frustrated by it or uninterested in it. And I just want to say, go see this, go read history. Find out why people were willing to sacrifice so much. The suffragists, the civil rights workers, and for heaven's sakes, show up and vote.
7 a.m. exit bed, step on mouth guard, which writer has apparently ejected in his sleep. Why does the writer wear a mouth guard at night? Because the writer grinds his teeth. Why? Because the writer finds himself constructing another overly complicated novel involving characters who live in a time writer never lived, and who do things like wind grandfather clocks and light whale oil lamps and other old-timey activities writer has never done. 7:02 let out dog. Upstairs from inside writer's laptop, the writer's novel yells, "You're dilly-dallying." Marilyn Robinson probably woke up at 5. 7:05 get dressed, the novel yells, "Nice sweatpants, Cheever put on a suit and tie to write, don't you?" 7:06 writer's iPhone on kitchen counter says, "Wanna know what preposterous new garbage Elon Musk said?" "Ignore that thing," says novel. "I've got a new recipe for minestrone," says iPhone. "It'll take 1 minute, 8 a.m. Novel says, "Now you've done it, you might as well fill a glass with gin right now." Nespresso machine on counter says 2 espressos can salvage the day, so long as he doesn't check email, says novel. 8:01 check email. Blurb request, want our new t-shirt, softest ever, delete. Oh, that shirt does look soft, maybe that blue color. 8:35 dog says, "We should walk." Novel says, "Colson Whitehead has probably finished 3 chapters by now." Water bottle beside sink says, "Have you ever actually cleaned me?" 8:55, drink from newly cleaned water bottle. Novel says, "At 3 a.m. last night, you had an idea about the scene with the drunk clockmaker. Remember?" Dog says, "Are we doing this or what?" iPhone says, "It's probably time you figure out what book talk is all about." 10 a.m. Novel says, "In the 3 hours you've been awake, James Patterson has already published 2 books." iPhone says, "When you're in New York City on Monday, your mom wants you to get a selfie with Sanjay Gupta." 10:36, mindlessly devour 2 chocolate donuts while staring out window. Spend rest of morning reading about boot scrapers in 18th century Paris. Make 6 pages of notes about Parisian boot scrapers, even though novel currently contains no boot scraper characters. 1 p.m., pile of neglected mail says, "You should probably open this Idaho gastroenterology envelope." 1:02 p.m., Google colonoscopy prep 64 ounces Gatorade whole bottle of Miralax, really, question mark? 1:04 p.m., take dog on long walk. 3 p.m. open laptop, invent new boot scraper character, insert boot scraper character into scene, have boot scraper character get drunk with clockmaker. 4:30 p.m. novel says, this new scene between the clockmaker and the boot scraper, we need to talk. iPhone says, GPT-4 can write an entire novel in like 4 seconds. 5 p.m. rewrite scene, 5:30 p.m. turn it back to the first version. 6 p.m. stomach says, wine? Novel says, stick with me 30 more minutes. From downstairs, Netflix says, there's a new season of Is It Cake? 9 p.m. Writer says, tomorrow I'll try again. Novel says, we'll see about that.
with a raspy laugh, an incisive mind, and her brutally honest margin notes. 40 years ago, when I was a young anonymous writer at Time magazine, my office mate and college friend, Evan Thomas, and I said, hey, let's write a book. It was sort of like, hey, let's put on the play. I've been covering the Reagan campaign, and I noticed that when you went to rallies, you got the pamphlets from people about the establishment, about the Council on Foreign Relations and the Rockefellers and the Bilderberg Group. I was from Louisiana. I didn't know what they were talking about, but Evan was a preppy. And so I said, what is this establishment thing? So we spent a few days in a very tacky group house in Sag Harbor and came up with a complex chart that most editors would have totally dismissed as a book idea. A group biography of 6 very little known statesmen who shaped the Cold War. I knew Binky Irving, who had just become an agent, and she says there's only one editor who will get what you're talking about. So we walked up Madison Street in Sag Harbor and sat on the back porch of Alice Mayhew. Just as we began our convoluted pitch, she cut us short. That's typical of her. She was always about 10 steps ahead of you. And she said, yes, I get it. It's a prequel to The Best and the Brightest, and we shall call it The Wise Men. As we were weaving the complex threads of 6 interacting characters, Alice would scribble in the margin in all caps, "Atigta," all things in good time. Keep it chronological. Whenever you get stuck, remember the 6 magic words. Let me tell you a story. She was deeply informed by her lapsed religion, and she said, if chronological narrative is good enough for the Bible, it's good enough for you. The Bible, she always reminded us, had the best lead sentence ever. In the beginning, comma. I came to realize in the ensuing years that what Alice had done with us, and with the many others who took pride in being part of what we called Alice authors, was to create and build a special genre in American letters. The genre of narrative nonfiction. Insider-informed books that were reported like journalism, but written like cinematic novels.
Alice was a tough cop. I remember it's 1973, so this is more than 50 years ago. Carl Bernstein and I had signed up to do a book with Simon & Schuster about Watergate. The only problem was that was the point at which Watergate burst open, and there were literally almost every day 4 or 5 front page stories in the Washington Post about Watergate. So we had in Adams Morgan at a Latin restaurant with Alice, we sat down with her and she said, what are you gonna do? And we said, well, you know, this story's getting out of control. And we hemmed and hawed and she pushed, and then she finally said, there's an important rule in writing, and that is write what you know best. And then she said, what you two know best is covering this story. Carl and I said, no, we want to write about the criminals in the Nixon White House. All of these people. And she said, no, you have no choice. You must write about yourselves. And it was necessity, and it was her insistence. There was no flexibility, no alternative. The story was out there. And so we agreed, and we started working on this manuscript. And by December 1973, we're holed up in the St. Regis Hotel here with Alice. We have this manuscript of reporting Watergate. It's really a reporting story. And We have typewriters, if you remember what those are. And Carl's typing away in one room, I'm typing in another room, and Alice comes up to me with a big sheaf of content from the book, about 90 pages, and she said, now this 90 pages, you need to cut 2. And cutting 2 out of 90? No problem at all. And she said, no, you cut the 90 pages down to 2. A painful moment. But she, of course, was right. And one of the things that I did 19 books over 46 years with Alice. And she not only was an editor, she was a teacher. And the best editors are teachers. And you get a manuscript from Alice, and she would edit, she would change words or suggest things. But she would write, there are 3 words or phrases she would use. Tone, she'd just write tone, write sometimes pace, and then she would write not NEC, meaning not necessary. So first time, this is 50 years ago, get one of these manuscripts and tone. What do you mean? And she said, the tone's wrong. I said, well, how is it wrong? And she said, you figure it out. Then pace, you say pace here. And what does that mean? She said, the pace is wrong. You figure it out. Then she would write, not necessary. And I knew what that meant. And she was right, and she was wise. And it was this idea of handing the ball off to the writer. Truly a great editor. The other thing, seeing we're closing this off about Simon & Schuster, we are really fortunate, I know this personally, to have John Karp as the CEO of Simon & Schuster. I'm going to give you a real-time report about John. Yesterday, wasn't yesterday Sunday, when most people are not working? John was on the phone with me for an hour and a half, I'm working on a book that focuses on the wars in Ukraine and in the Middle East, and we're going through, and he is saying, you know, there are other things going on in the world, like Trump and the border, and he is making the case, you know, just be aware of those distant sounds of America and the world that affect us and impact us in such a way. And so I got a little defensive and said, well, no, wait a minute here and that. And so we exchanged emails. And I apologized a little bit and said, you know, you're right about some, but I'm going to push back on the rest of this. Now, this is not 2 weeks ago or 2 years ago. This is yesterday. And we finished our exchange of emails and our conversations, and I got an email from him, which I will post all of my life, remaining life, by the computer. And the email says, and yes, just so you have it in writing and in classic font, we are behind you no matter what. Now think of that. We are behind you no matter what. What does that mean? That means that the First Amendment is alive, Simon & Schuster is alive, Jonathan Karp is alive, and I'm tagging along at age 81. We're so lucky to have that. I mean, if you, I will not send out all the emails to everyone, or, but I mean, it was fierce and direct, but not personal, and we are behind you no matter what. Means write the effing book your way. Thank you.
I would like to thank you, the readers. Here's to another 100 years. Thank you and good night.